The radical act of real self care. Why bubble baths aren't enough. When was the last time you said no to something and didn't feel guilty about it? That question sits at the heart of what we're discussing today. Because somewhere along the way, we've been sold a dangerous lie about what it means to take care of ourselves. I recently had the privilege of interviewing Mex Ra, a visionary and revolutionary force in redefining self care for Black professionals and entrepreneurs. What struck me most about our conversation wasn't just Mex Ra's profound insights, but how they've transformed countless lives by challenging the superficial narratives around wellness that dominate our culture. Their work has created ripples of change across communities that have been historically marginalized and overlooked in conversations about well being. Through their groundbreaking approach, Mex Ra has empowered thousands to reclaim their right to authentic self preservation in a world that often demands their sacrifice. The glossy magazines tell us self care is bubble baths, scented candles, and weekend getaways. But what if that's just a distraction? What if real self care is something far more radical, more necessary, and ultimately more transformative? The truth is, we've been thinking about self care all wrong, and it's costing us our well being, our peace, and sometimes even our lives. Self care isn't a luxury, it isn't selfish, and it certainly isn't something you can purchase in a bottle. Real self care is an act of resistance in a world that expects you to keep going until you break. For Black women, especially, who face the compounded pressures of racism, sexism, and often the expectation to be endlessly strong, this redefinition isn't just important, it's essential for survival. As Mex Ra explained during our interview, genuine self care goes beyond superficial acts. It's about setting boundaries, protecting your peace, and making intentional choices that support your long term mental and emotional health, not just providing momentary relief. Let me be clear, there's nothing wrong with enjoying a spa day, but if that's where your self care begins and ends, you're missing the deeper work. True self care is learning to say no without explanation when something doesn't serve you. True self care is recognizing which relationships drain you and which ones fill you up. True self care is creating spaces where you can thrive, not just survive. And sometimes true self care means walking away from environments that diminish you, even when those environments come with prestige, security, or the approval of others. Consider the work being done by DC Royal Gems, an organization that curates intentional mindfulness spaces specifically for Black professionals and entrepreneurs. Their story is powerful and illuminating. Their participants weren't struggling because they lacked bubble baths or vacation time. They were burning out from overwork, microaggressions in corporate settings, and a profound lack of culturally relevant support. The solution wasn't more indulgence, it was boundary setting workshops, it was meditation practices rooted in cultural affirmation, it was community building sessions where people could be fully themselves without the constant tax of code switching. I spoke with one participant who told me, before finding these spaces, I thought something was wrong with me because traditional wellness practices weren't helping. I was still exhausted, still anxious, still feeling like I was failing. Then I realized it wasn't me that was broken. It was the definition of self care I'd been given. The results speak volumes. Participants reported reduced anxiety levels and greater confidence in asserting their needs at work. What began as local meetups grew into regional events, drawing hundreds each month, influencing similar programs nationwide. This is what happens when we redefine self care as collective healing rather than individual escape. Or take Kayla Bryson, an African American mental performance coach working with athletes and their families in communities where mental health often carries heavy stigma. Where seeking help is seen as weakness, Kayla introduced proactive check ins focused on stress recognition before it escalates. She didn't wait for crisis to hit. She didn't tell struggling young athletes to just take a day off. She created systems of ongoing support, educating parents on supporting student athlete wellness beyond physical training and advocating for accessible mindfulness routines as everyday practice. The biggest shift, Kayla told me, was getting families to understand that mental health isn't something you address when there's a problem. It's something you nurture every single day, just like physical training. You wouldn't tell an athlete to only drink water when they're already dehydrated. The impact, increased willingness among clients and their families to discuss emotional needs openly, measurable reduction in burnout episodes, a significant contribution toward normalizing conversations around mental health within sports culture among young Black athletes. This is what happens when we shift from reactive care to preventative care, from fix it when broken to invest early and consistently. But individual actions, while powerful, aren't enough. Systems matter too. A recent study of K 12 arts teachers facing rising anxiety and burnout rates post pandemic reveals this truth. These educators weren't failing at self care because they didn't value themselves. They were drowning in chronic underfunding, increased workloads due to staff shortages, and the pressure to provide emotional labor without institutional backing. Their solution wasn't individual, it was collective. Teachers began advocating together for systemic changes, regular wellness check ins embedded into schedules, and built mutual aid networks sharing practical tools and resources tailored for educators' realities. They implemented group debriefs after stressful events instead of isolated coping. They encouraged leadership to model vulnerability regarding their own need for rest and support. One teacher shared, "For years, I thought I was failing at self care. I bought the candles, downloaded the meditation apps, tried to squeeze in me time between grading papers until midnight and waking up at 5 a.m. It never worked. What finally helped wasn't another self care app. It was when our school recognized that teacher well being needed to be built into the system, not treated as an individual responsibility." The outcomes were remarkable: improved retention rates, higher satisfaction scores, and fewer sick days compared with previous years. This is what happens when we recognize that changing systems, not just individuals, is a key part of modernizing our understanding and practice of real world self care. Many of these teachers had previously internalized guilt over needing breaks, a mindset rooted both in educator culture and broader societal expectations placed upon women and minorities. Sound familiar? How many of us have been taught that our worth is tied to our productivity, that taking time for ourselves is somehow selfish or weak? These beliefs don't arise in a vacuum. They're cultivated in a culture that profits from our exhaustion, that measures success by output rather than well being, that celebrates the hustle while ignoring the human cost. For Black women navigating corporate America, as our podcast, The Pink Parachute Diaries, consistently highlights, this cost is particularly steep. When talented Black women are handed pink slips while underperforming men receive golden parachutes, the message is clear: your well being is not a priority. But what if we decided differently? What if we collectively embraced a deeper approach towards self care? We'd see less chronic burnout across professions. We'd develop more empowered leaders capable not only of surviving adversity, but thriving through it. We'd build stronger communities where collective well being takes priority over performative displays or short lived fixes. This shift would particularly benefit marginalized groups whose unique stressors are often overlooked by mainstream narratives about wellness. The revolution begins with boundaries. It begins with recognizing that saying no isn't selfish, it's necessary. It begins with understanding that removing yourself from toxic environments isn't giving up. It's an act of radical self preservation. It begins with acknowledging that your worth isn't measured by your productivity, your availability, or your willingness to endure mistreatment. As Audre Lorde famously said, caring for myself is not self indulgence, it is self preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. She understood that in a world that expects Black women to sacrifice themselves for others, choosing yourself is revolutionary. This understanding is at the core of what Mex Ra shared with me, that for Black professionals and entrepreneurs, especially, genuine self care means knowing when to say no, limiting access to those who drain you, and creating spaces where you can thrive. So I challenge you today, will you continue to accept the commercialized, superficial version of self care that's been sold to you? Or will you embrace the radical, revolutionary act of true self preservation? Will you dare to set boundaries that make others uncomfortable? Will you have the courage to walk away from spaces that diminish you, even when society tells you to be grateful for a seat at the table? Will you recognize that your well being is not a luxury, but a necessity, not just for yourself, but for every life you touch? The revolution of real self care begins with a single powerful act, honoring yourself enough to protect your peace, your energy, and your spirit, not as an occasional indulgence, but as a fundamental human right. And in a world that profits from your exhaustion, that is truly the most radical act of all.